Welcome to the Lensrentals Podcast. I'm Ryan Hill, and this week, Lensrentals Blog Editor Zach Sutton sat down with Sef McCullough, a digital artist, photo retoucher, educator whose clients include Nike, Google, Coca-Cola, and more. This isn't a topic we cover a lot, but retouching is a crucial element of commercial photography that can feel kind of tough to break into for beginners or for experts. Sef and Zach are going to try to illuminate this a little and give you an idea about how this niche industry works. They'll also talk a little bit about education and the responsibility that privileged working professionals have to open the gates and share what they've been allowed to learn. Here's Zach.
Sef, thanks for joining us.
Zach, thank you so much for having me. We finally get to talk.
Yeah. I feel like we run in a lot of the same circles within the industry and see each other in passing quite a bit, but haven't really had much time to sit down and actually have a conversation. So I'm excited for this. So yeah, I wanted to kind of start this conversation talking a little bit about you, explaining to our listeners kind of who you are, what you do. So how did you get your start in retouching? You've been a retoucher for over 15 years now, which is sort of a niche market to a lot of people. So yeah, how did you get involved in retouching?
Well, I got into it sort of as a generalist. You know, when I was sort of mid-college, I was doing digital work and I thought maybe I was going to be a graphic designer, maybe I was going to be an illustrator, maybe I was going to be a painter. And so I ended up training as a fine art painter, but the whole time I was getting jobs doing digital work, mostly in graphic design. I really kind of got my break at what was back in the day called a multimedia company. And so these guys, this place called White Shark Systems in Santa Cruz, California, these guys hired me from a coffee shop, just a total fresh-faced kid who didn't know anything but knew kind of how to use Photoshop. And these guys basically taught me the foundations of digital production in a real studio environment. We were making websites, web animations with a piece of software called Future Splash. You ever heard of that?
No.
It was the first vector animation program in the world for
Okay.
And it later became known as Flash. I always laugh at that first name that they came up with. But anyway, so just getting into dealing with graphics and getting into dealing with how actual companies make digital work and ship it. And then finally graduating school and getting a super lucky break and landing a job at the ad agency Wieden & Kennedy in their retouching department. A series of strokes of luck, pure luck.
So you got a position at an ad agency. Is that where you sort of built the foundation for your commercial client list then?
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't know it at the time, but working in an agency, I crossed paths over 6 years of being a retoucher there with so many different professionals that now I kind of know someone at every agency on the West Coast. And that is a really good thing to keep in mind for people who are trying to plan careers in a lot of different fields. If you can get your foot in the door at an agency or company that's a little bit bigger, the contacts you make there in those companies can really travel with you for many years.
So retouching is something that fundamentally we don't cover a lot here on Lensrentals. Well, I think for a lot of people in photography in general, they kind of look at retouching as sort of an afterthought. But, now people are sort of left, a lot of extra time.
Yeah.
So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about retouching and, what tools you need to get to start retouching better, to become a better retoucher. What tools would you recommend? Let's say I am a complete newbie. I just bought my first camera. I'm taking photos of my friends when I have time. Mm-hmm. I want to become a full-time professional retoucher. What tools do you recommend to take your retouching to the next level?
Well, that's great because, that's really the person that I'm trying to talk to more these days because my teaching, my instruction, my tutorial products, have always been to teach the really advanced techniques of commercial retouching. And right now, I'm really trying to find ways to communicate more with people who are at that place of like, I want to start getting into this. So I'm really trying to provide a courtesy ramp for people who might be intimidated by retouching. And I mean, first off, it's like, yep, you got to get Photoshop. I would also recommend a Wacom tablet. In the past, Wacom products were expensive and, limited access, but they've changed that. And that's one of the reasons that I actually really like Wacom as a company is they've continued to make really, really high quality products more accessible to people. So
yeah,
you can get a Cintiq is what's called a display tablet. So it's not just a tablet, it's a screen that you can work on. Those used to be really expensive, and the pro models really still are, but they've continued to make versions of those that are cheaper. And now you have the Wacom One, which is a really awesome piece of tech that's accessible to most consumers. So those are the first two kind of core products. I don't think you need to worry too much about some kind of fancy $2,000 monitor. I always recommend the Dell Ultra Sharp series of monitors, 27-inch, and those are, like $300-$400. If you got a decent screen, you've got Photoshop, and you've got a tablet to work on, you're pretty much ready to go.
So now you've got your tools, you bought yourself a tablet, you're kind of set to start retouching. If you were to pick just a couple skill sets, like what skill sets do you think that people need to master first and foremost when it comes to retouching?
It does depend on the market that you're in. So there are a number of considerations. First is looking at what's around you. Do you live in a city or do you live in a small village in the north of the UK? For people who are trying to get into commercial retouching, I say look around you and see what kind of imagery is being produced and by who. Are there photography studios nearby that do product retouching? That do product photography, Paying attention to what those opportunities might be, first of all, can sort of guide your training. Fashion and beauty retouching is kind of the prevalent, model out there for people. And it's what they know most because it's got the most visibility. There's a lot of competition there and not a lot of opportunity. And also the price tags for that work are not generally very high compared to commercial retouching for brands or agencies or photography studios. Think about walking down this, the street in, like Times Square or something, and looking around you and seeing all the imagery that is produced for our wonderful consumer culture. You'll see a fraction of it being fashion and beauty, cosmetics, stuff like that. And then there's the entire rest of the universe of imagery that's produced. That's commercial retouching. Every single one of those images is getting retouched by someone. So if you can get good just initially at the stuff that goes into prepping commercial retouching, and that's basically file organization and layer structure, it relies heavily on making clipping paths, to some degree, a little bit of color correction, and also using the tools to do cleanup, clone stamp tool, healing brush tool. Everybody thinks that to get into retouching, they need to create a portfolio of all this like crazy creative compositing work before they can show their portfolio to someone who might hire them. I say that is the wrong way to go. When you're trying to break into a retouching job, it's going to be a foot in the door kind of thing, and nobody wants to hire a creative butterfly at that stage. They want to hire someone who understands how to deal with images, how to prep them for the production pipeline, essentially. Entry-level positions usually are where you come in because there's been a massive influx of a project with lots of images. Maybe it's a photography studio and they just shot a ton of exercise machines that all need to be cleaned up and corrected. Doesn't sound sexy, but that is work,
Yeah.
And that's what I tell people is look for that low hanging fruit and know what they want you to be able to do, which is the prep stuff. And you can learn that, you can learn that from me. I do have a tutorial that shows the exact process. And you can dig around on YouTube, but most of the stuff you find on YouTube is going to focus, I think, more on the creative wow factor stuff, which is great. A lot of my friends teach that and they do it really well. So finding stuff that is actually about like the not so sexy parts of retouching that will actually land you a job are a little bit harder to find.
Right. No, and I found that too. I'm a beauty photographer by trade.
Mm-hmm.
And I get asked pretty regularly, in regards to retouching, just like, how do you do this? How do you do that? Et cetera, et cetera. And people don't understand that a lot of the job is just fundamentals.
Mm-hmm.
There is no like big shortcuts. It's just, you have to learn, you have to train your eyes to sort of see various flaws in the images and just be able to correct them with very simple tools within Photoshop. And it just takes a lot of time.
Right. And the beginning is kind of putting in the time, and it is time intensive. And I was just talking yesterday with another retoucher about how we now take for granted the thing you just mentioned about having the eye to see things that need to get fixed in an image. Stuff that's easy for us to see now that comes almost naturally is actually a result of a lot of time spent looking. Because I come from a tradition of figure drawing, and specifically blind contour drawing is something I went deep into, and I call it deep looking. It's spending a long amount of time looking at a subject, and something happens when you spend that amount of time to the wiring in your brain, and it's worth doing, I think.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, no, that's a great point. And you had mentioned, education and learning some of these things. So let's talk a little bit about that, because along with being just an absolutely incredible retoucher that has worked with some of the biggest brands in the world, you also teach a lot of education. And probably beyond anything else that I really admire about you is that you aren't afraid to show people how you work. I think so much of this industry is sort of built on this, like, I've got secrets I can't show anybody. But I've certainly seen some of your work where you're showing, your entire workflow, kind of the breakdown of your layers and sort of the pre-production on a little bit of stuff. Walk me through where you found sort of your purpose in education and how you got started in that and why it's such a big component of what you do.
Oh, man. Well, I mean, thank you for saying all that nice stuff about me. I really appreciate that. And I'm glad that to hear you say that, because I think my intention is coming through if you're saying those things about me. I started out wanting to teach, and it took me a while to realize this. I was always really uncomfortable with the way that retouching as an industry and as a craft was always locked behind closed doors and closely guarded. I always sort of loathed an art or a craft that was predicated on limiting access to tools and methods. The thing that bugged me too, and this is especially important to be aware of right now, is I had access to all of those private spaces or growing up in the industry because I looked a lot like the people who already worked there. They were mostly men who I looked like and I fit in. I was a good artist and I was friendly and likable, but I was particularly unimpressive in like my work ethics and my sort of professional presentation. But I still got access to those spaces because I had the privilege to enter them. So reflecting on that whole history is part of one of the reasons that I want to take all of the stuff that I've learned and make it available to people. And I try to do that as much as I can for free even, which is why I started this recent Facebook group, Everyday Photoshop, and also why I just set up a website called, it's www.frequencyseparation.com. And it's kind of my new project to start putting up and giving away the tools that I use, like my actions, my brushes are going to be up there. That stuff is going to be available for free. This sort of gets back to this whole thing that I think we're talking about is sort of an abundance mentality in general, in life, in art, about, hey, it's cool. We're going to create and we're going to build, and we don't need to be scared that somebody's going to come and take our stuff, or laugh at us or call us a fake, because if you're really out there trying to build and create authentically the best you can, then you get my props for that, because you're getting out there. And that is an act of bravery as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, absolutely. So on that note, we're kind of talking about our own sort of identity within the work that we produce.
Mm-hmm.
You're working with teams. You're probably getting assets from, a third party. You're getting photographs from another photographer. How do you work that into your workflow where you can still maintain both their identity and their vision of a project, as well as, your own subtleties?
Yeah, good question. Because on lots of jobs for a retoucher, you're just an operator. And lots of retouchers actually really like that. I've worked with so many retouchers who are just happy to sit there, be in the chair, clip and clean all day and watch Game of Thrones on their second screen. And I mean, I was there at a point too. I was like, cool, if I'm just doing process work all day, I'm getting paid, I'm just listening to podcasts. That changed for me pretty dramatically at a certain point where I felt like just doing stuff that I wasn't going to get any better at and that essentially a robot should be able to do. I began really, really focusing on the creativity aspect. I mean, I'll still do jobs that are pretty process oriented just to get paid, less and less now because I have less and less tolerance for that type of work. I'll usually farm that out to my friends who need work more and more now. And using other people's photography, and it's kind of how I've come up, is really, and maybe almost somehow deliberately, totally not educated as a photographer. I just, at the end of last year, bought my first real camera.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So I've had like a long career not knowing jack about photography. I know a lot about visual communication and art. And it's funny that I've been able to do that. I was always wondering if I'd be able to do it or if I was going to fail because I was totally ignorant about photography. And it's really allowed me to have a relationship with photographs that they are essentially raw materials for making art, which might sound a little like cold. But it took me a long time to actually really engage with the photograph as a meaningful medium, which I've evolved now. I mean, I have become closer with photographs as just the photograph out of camera as a meaningful work. It took me a while though, because I've always just used photographs to create the stuff that I think of as artwork. So
yeah,
those projects that are open to me putting my perspective into, and I do find clients. I mean, I just last year on this recent LeBron campaign worked with an art director and a creative director at Nike who were just incredible. Like they were so open to collaboration with me, which is not always the case, that I was blown away. And together we were able to make something that was actually really special. And it's some of my favorite work to date.
Well, on that note, we're going to take a short break. And when we get back, we'll continue talking to Sef McCullough. All right. And we are back, and we are joined here again with Sef McCullough, who's an incredible retoucher. And he's talking to us a little bit about workflow. When we left, we were talking about collaboration. So much of your work is collaborating with a creative director, with a photographer, kind of executing their vision. I want to talk a little bit about licensing. I've always been taught as a photographer that I maintain the copyright of the images I produce. What licensing do you have as a retoucher?
Yeah, that's a good question. Retouchers have come from a history of basically being underdogs, whereas photographers always get credit in an image publication. Retouchers rarely ever do. And it's because we as technicians came out of being essentially scanner operators. And that's particularly unsexy. Sitting in a dark room, taking somebody else's photographs and putting them into a drum scanner. These people were very, very technical and very, very skilled in terms of understanding imaging. And so they started to improve the images and retouch them. And it comes a lot from that darkroom metaphor. So that's like all of our terminology around retouching. And the term retouching itself is something I dislike more and more because it seems so niche and so technical. But on the other hand, Photoshopper is not awesome either because it implies a hobbyist. So
right.
I hope in the future, we get better language for describing what we do somewhere more in the realm of digital art. Yeah. And licensing, basically the only thing that I retain control over are my layered working files. And I've had some knockdown dragouts with, let's say, uneducated clients before. Even clients who had signed a contract that I gave them that said, I do not give you my working files. There's some surprising ignorance to the rights and responsibilities around that stuff, which I've worked hard to try to educate my friends in the field about. What we do provide are, simplified layered files for people because, lots of times our clients need to move stuff around. Okay, we'll set that up for you, but we need to agree to that up front. Beyond that, there's no additional licensing. You get paid for a job and you walk away. The other thing I'd say, though, is that because I'm doing this a lot now, I'm really into this idea of showing people how I build files. And in the past, I was a little unsure about the legality of that. And after a lot of research and talking to a lot of other retoucher friends in the industry, it's been decided that when we're showing files and how we build them for educational purposes, that is it's an ethical use of showing people how we do things, and it is not in breach of any law or contract unless you've agreed to something specifically.
I want to kind of divert a little bit and talk to you about your website that you've been building that's kind of designed to educate people. And that website is frequencyseparation.com. First off, great domain name. So I want to actually talk a little bit about frequency separation because, I remember when it first was, discovered, and photographers went crazy. They were like, this is amazing. This changes everything. This is that shortcut that we're looking for.
Yeah.
And then at least as a beauty photographer, since then it has scaled back considerably.
Yeah.
Whenever I do a Q&A or anything, people ask if I use frequency separation. I usually tell them no.
Totally.
Because at least on a traditional sense, it seems to kind of go heavy handed. But before we get into your kind of passion in sort of reinventing frequency separation's image, tell us a little bit about what frequency separation is.
Yeah, it sounds kind of mysterious or technical because it's basically a metaphor that was taken from sound engineering, separating frequencies that have different profiles, I guess. So the thing I tell people is frequency separation is actually a pretty simple concept when it comes down to it. It's just processing your photograph in Photoshop so that all of the tools that are already in Photoshop that just work so much better. You're just splitting your image up into layers, one for tone and one for texture. But when you do that, your photograph doesn't look any different. It just allows you to work in a way that's way more flexible and less painful.
So give us like an example on how you would use frequency separation in some of the work that you do.
Oh, yeah. Well, so for me, frequency separation is essentially the beating heart of every file that I work on. And I don't think of it so much as a specific tool. I think of it as a structure. I really firmly believe that this is the future of how we work on our images. But this is just the beta version. Thinking about how you need to do some Photoshop work on an image when you need to, like, say, do some cleanup, or you need to remove something from your shot, or maybe you need to move an element or add an element. These are what I call, pixel manipulations. So it's not doing color grading and stuff like that. That's fine. But once you have to start breaking out, your clone tool, your healing brush tool, stuff like that, that's where you start running into some pain points. And it's usually what scares most photographers, I think, and why they would run for a retoucher or just say, yeah, I can't do that with that image, so that image goes in the trash can. When you start thinking of your images broken into visual components, it just makes sense because it is how we see things in reality. The experimentation that I'm doing now with actually pushing past frequency separation is much broader. It's about how can we actually process the image in Photoshop to make it so that the things I'm doing to the image are interdependent. They relate to each other and they interact with each other, but they're broken up in a way that allows me to make changes to, fine detail without worrying about large areas of tone. And that just makes it so much easier. And once we go beyond that to thinking about other ways that we can break up our image, because wouldn't it be great to be able to, in a portrait, be able to adjust differences in skin tone in different parts of the body in a matter of seconds? It's totally possible once you start thinking about your image broken up into different components. And just stepping into this mindset really makes it so that you feel much more free to be able to tackle harder changes that you need to make with your images.
So you have a platform built to teach photographers how to become better retouchers. I will fully admit at this point, I have hired a retoucher full time in my work. And it's simply
awesome.
because I don't have time to both photograph as often as I do, as well as retouch images. Yeah. Now, what advice would you give to a photographer that is looking to hire a retoucher?
Yeah. Once again, that's really is a market dependent consideration. But there are some things that I've heard from my friends who are photographers about that process, and they can find it pretty difficult. It's hard for them to know if a retoucher that they're talking to is actually the right fit or has the skills at a level that they need. It is a relationship, and it should be. You can send your work off to production retouching companies, many overseas, and they'll clip and clean up your images. But I'm guessing you need a higher level of finish. You need an artist to be working on your photographs. And that has to do with really getting out there and really talking to people. I always recommend for sort of aspiring photographers, maybe people just coming out of maybe college or maybe a different educational track for photography, try to find someone also who's really good at Photoshop. They may not even be calling themselves a retoucher early in their career, and really partner with and collaborate with them and work on test projects with someone who really is on that Photoshop track. And in a university or school setting, that can be pretty easy to do because you're interacting with people a lot. Online, it's a little tougher, but those conversations can still happen. And, definitely I see it all the time on ProEdu's Facebook community. People are putting themselves out there, showing their work, trying to learn from people. And I see lots of collaborations happening between people online. just start working with someone before you actually need it on a live job, I think I would say.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because when it comes down to the wire, it can be tough because you're just like, I got to go with you because this job's got to get done. And if you are going to test with somebody, whether it's paid or free, still treat the whole thing like a real professional job.
Absolutely.
Don't be like, okay, thanks. Yeah, I'll get to those images next week. Treat it like a real job because you're going to impress that person. And also don't do crazy creative butterfly stuff with their images. Understand whether this is a photographer like you or a brand you're trying to work for or an agency you're trying to work for. I always say before you approach somebody and before you show them your portfolio, understand what their actual visual voice is like. Understand what they are trying to create and what their style is. And if your communication or your portfolio mimics that style and shows back to them what they're already making, the chances of you getting hired are way higher. Because if you have the wrong thing in your portfolio, you might have the first 6 images of your portfolio totally hit that brand voice. And then the producer scrolls down below and there's all of a sudden like fine art nudes in your portfolio. You know what I mean? They're going to be like, oh, okay. So they didn't understand that visual voice of the previous 6 images that I saw because they're using a different one here. It sort of detracts from it. That's advice I give to a lot of people about portfolios and understanding their target. Showing your target clients that you will understand the briefs that they give you and you will execute them accurately.
Yeah. I mean, as a beauty photographer, any test shoot, pretty much any shoot that I do, whether it just be an unpaid test or a paid test, we always start with like a clean beauty look. It's always kind of the basic kind of fundamental stuff that really gets the attention of a lot of the brands and the bigger jobs.
I'm honestly, a subscriber to the, if you build it, they will come model. It just could take some time. If you continually take steps toward the direction that you want to go towards the destination, each one of those steps is going to push you further in that direction. I like that idea of every vanilla shoot you do, execute it to a high degree, and then tack on some additional stuff that is material for stepping toward that destination that you want to get to. That's great.
And on that note, I think we can probably wrap this up. Thank you so much, Sef, for joining us today. Is there anything that you want to plug before we go here?
Not really. No, I mean, this has been great. I love these conversations where we depart from just the technical of how you do things and more into like the ethics and why you do things and how like creativity and art is what we are really doing here. And so we need to always have conversations around that. The tools though, I mean, this is kind of my current thing now, is I'm going to continue to build and put out all of my Photoshop actions and tools for people. And it's just a current project of mine. So check in if anybody's listening to this, get in touch with me if you want certain problems that you have in retouching solved. I'm going to see what I can do and put out tools that help everybody get better.
Perfect. And people can see more of your work at your website, sefmccullough.com.
Yeah.
You've got frequencyseparation.com.
That's where all the tools are going to be posted. That's going to be basically my repository for people to get my tools.
Excellent. And then, of course, I'm sure you're on all the social media, Facebook, Instagram, etc.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you again so much for joining us. And that's the Lensrentals Podcast. Thanks for listening.
Yeah, this has been great. Thank you, Zach.
Yeah, of course.
Thanks for listening to the Lensrentals Podcast. Sef's website, again, is sefmccullough.com. That's SefMcCullough.com. You can also find him on Instagram at Sef McCullough, and we'll link to all the educational resources he mentioned in the show notes.
The Lensrentals Podcast is a production of Lensrentals.com. If you've got a question or topic you'd like covered on the show, email us at podcast@lensrentals.com or leave us a voicemail at 901-609-LENS. That's 901-609-LENS. If you're enjoying the show, please review us on iTunes and subscribe in your podcast app of choice. Make sure to check the show notes for a link to this week's coupon code, and as always, Roger Cicala will leave you with an inspirational quote.